Hi there. This video is going to take a look at water footprints and shortages as part of a broader discussion of population, consumption, and the environment. Since the 1950s, global demand for water has tripled, and that's because uh, irrigation primarily. 70% of world water use, as much as 80% I've seen in other places, is used for irrigation purposes. 20% of global water use is for industry, but only 10% is for residential use, although that's significant, but the overall picture points to irrigation for agriculture, followed by industry as the big water users. And 10% of irrigation for grain is non-renewable, so that means we're relying on what we call fossil aquifers, which are non-renewable groundwater sources. So the United Nations expects water shortages to be exacerbated rather than a lack of arable land as the greatest threat to agricultural productivity declines, just as population growth is going up. So, if we look at renewable water sources by nation, uh, per capita, and comparing 2005 to projected 2030 level, you can see Kuwait already has a very limited amount of water, and is expected to have less by 2030. Uh, Same for United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. These are very arid places that are also seeing population growth. They're also areas, they're oil producing countries, which also means there's a great deal of industry happening. And as we mentioned, industry is a big water user. So there's almost no agricultural potential for these countries. They're totally food dependent on imports or on what we call grabs, land grabs. Um, so these are some of the concerning cases. You can see this list is much longer than that, but many of the countries on this list are in very arid or semi-arid regions of the world and are looking at really crisis level limits to water. Saudi Arabia was actually self-sufficient in wheat production for 2 decades, but its last harvest was in 2012 because of it. It was relying heavily on non-renewable groundwater aquifers that were deep in the ground, and they were using their oil drilling technology, which is very good to access these ancient aquifers. But because they're non-renewable, it's essentially completely tapped out. In Yemen, tap water is available every 4 days, and grain harvests are down by over a third. And of course, there's a war between these countries, and water is expected to be the basis for armed conflict around the world. This is just the latest incident where we're seeing this take place. So irrigation wells are going dry in all of the most populous countries, US, India, and China. Um, just as aquifers are being depleted, more water is being diverted to urban areas for industry and residential use, which leaves less available for food production and irrigation. The big three grain producers vary in terms of their reliance on irrigation. The United States is fortunate. Only 20% of its agriculture depends on irrigation. The situation is much worse in India and China, which are reliant on 60 and 80% respectively. And as we mentioned, the Middle East is the most threatened of all areas. Some of these nations have already essentially run out of water. To make matters worse, of the available freshwater sources in China, 80% of rivers are too polluted to support life. 300 million people drink somewhat contaminated water, while 70 million are drinking highly contaminated water. In Kenya, Lake Naivasha is slowly being drained, unfortunately, for the production of cut flowers. So, not even for a very efficient use, but there's a multi-billion dollar flower industry driven primarily by the United Kingdom, which is the major importer. And these roses are being grown because they are valuable from a economic standpoint, and unfortunately, economics don't always reflect human need, right? So although it may bring in money, it also has a very negative ecological consequence. And the opportunity cost, instead of growing food here, means that Kenya is now less self-sufficient when it comes to food. So a lot of this comes to the concept of virtual water. Whenever a country uses water to produce agricultural commodities, and then it turns around and exports those commodities, they're also exporting all the water that went into producing that. So we call that virtual water exports. And so that's what we mean by the term virtual water. It's embedded in objects that require water to grow. And it's not just food, it's flowers, it's some medicines, it's some textiles like cotton, flax, and those kinds of things. And so, of course, it varies quite a bit by type of food. Again, beef leading the way in terms of water intensity. The U.S. is a leading exporter of water, followed by, well, Sri Lanka is a leading importer. Right? It's bringing in a lot more water than it's sending out. Of course, a lot of those Middle Eastern countries are also big importers, certainly relative to what they export, which is essentially nothing. And gravity irrigation is less efficient than sprinkler or drip irrigation. But a lot of these countries are still relying on older methods of irrigation that are less efficient. When it comes to virtual water imports and exports, you can see the U.S. is followed by Canada, Thailand, Argentina, India, and Australia for sending water out. In terms of bringing water in, it's Sri Lanka, Japan, the Netherlands, Korea, China, Indonesia. So these are more populous places. One thing we can say is some of the most desperate arid countries are also not the largest or the biggest consumers of water, but certainly have the potential to be that way. If you look at the food water breakdown over time, you can see that as a share, animal products, represented by this black line, have been growing, right? So more countries are gaining the ability to eat meat, basically, is what that means. Cereals and roots have remained relatively stable. Oil crops have gone up, as have vegetables and fruits, but the big change here is mostly animal products. Here's another way to think about this ground beef 20,000 liters of water in terms of virtual water in a kilogram of beef. Uh, Same with coffee. A kilogram of coffee has 20,000 liters of water embedded in it. Quite a bit of water goes into producing coffee. It takes 5 years for a coffee plant to start producing beans. So that's part of the issue there. Cheese, 5,000 liters as an animal product. Rice, also, as far as grains go, is very high in terms of its use of water compared to, say, wheat. Of course, it's grown in water. Rice paddies are grown in water, freshwater sources. Sugar is also very high in terms of its water reliance. Uh, so a lot of this raises questions about water rights and the question of whether or not people have a right to water or if water is a commodity. And one of the things we're seeing globally is a privatization of water sources. So people have to pay to drink water, which raises some concerns about human rights. People can't survive without water. So one argument is water should be a human right, and therefore it shouldn't be privatized. But we are seeing major companies like Nestle and other multinational corporations buying access to fresh water sources and monopolizing access where they can and selling it right back to municipalities and to residential users and to farmers. And the World Bank and IMF require borrowing nations to privatize their water systems, actually. So the global lending institutions are actually encouraging this sort of activity. So private companies, they're there to make a profit and recoup investments. Poor nations are full of people that are unable to pay for water. Uh, so that means that these types of places are not viewed as worthy of investment. So water sources are not improved, and Water delivery systems are sometimes lacking in areas that most desperately need that investment. Private water companies have not invested in the infrastructure of poor nations because they don't expect to recoup the costs. And the governments often have no resources to do anything. They're totally at the whim of these private companies. Since 1990, 51 million people drink water supplied by a private firm. That number has gone up. By 2015, that number was about a billion, 1.1 billion. So you can see the rate of change is dramatic. It's even higher than that now. And arguably, it's unethical to deny people a substance they need for survival that falls from the sky. And it is possible actually for private companies to have the level of um, water access that it's illegal for people in some countries to use water catchment systems. In other words, to catch water in buckets and drink it is illegal in some countries that have privatized water. So this really is a cause for concern. In 2010, the United Nations moved to identify water and sanitation as a basic human right. And there's some more information at this website. But the United Nations has no power to sanction governments. Moreover, climate change, because of its disruption of the hydrologic system globally, is exacerbating water supply problems. Russia had a heat wave in 2010 that shrank their grain harvest dramatically by 40%. Uh, Meanwhile, it's causing massive flooding that also ruins millions of acres of cropland, as we saw in Pakistan the same year. Also, livestock drowned in massive flooding. So, not to mention people. People die in floods. Flooding is the most damaging of all natural disasters. We're also seeing massive land grabs, as we mentioned earlier, especially those countries in the Middle East that are totally dependent on imports. They are buying land in poor countries in order to grow food for themselves. So these poor countries are, as a result, losing agricultural capacity. All right, so that's a pattern we're seeing. China has bought a lot of land. South Korea has bought a lot, but Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates and some other of the Middle Eastern countries that are in very arid parts of the world are almost forced to invest in agriculture in other countries because they have no capacity to grow food themselves. All right, that's it. We'll come back to the topic in a couple more videos. Thank you.